Very good morning to you. It is Monday, the 20th of February 2023. I trust that your day has started off well. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuned in and watching us from. Today, here are the latest headlines from across the continent of Africa. We start with the newspapers from Kenya. The Daily Nation. Big class divide in junior high. A public school had 2 teachers for 171 students. Yet a private academy had 6 tutors for 40 learners. Congestion. Some classes have 60 learners, far more than the maximum 45 recommended for better student-teacher interaction. And the facilities, learners in private academies have laboratories, online teaching aids that their peers in public schools lack. And on training, schools lament that most of the newly posted graduate teachers lack skills to teach the competence-based curriculum. That is a report on the pioneering CBC class, which has just joined junior secondary school in grade 7. So I think these are just some of the teaching challenges that are being experienced. Ruto goes silent on state capture. 2022 poll probes President allies say the inquests are not urgent, that the head of state has more pressing issues to deal with at the moment. That story is on page 4. And then rebel MPs to form anti-Raila liberation group. Azimio la Umoja One Kenya leader Raila Odinga is facing a fresh rebellion in his Nyanza backyard as alleged rebel legislators malformation of a liberation group to cut him down to size with the help of President William Ruto's administration. The name has reportedly been coined to symbolize plans to liberate the region from the grip of the Odingas. That story is on page 5. Taxing idle land will spur growth, senators told. Importation cartels invade sector. Some 13 local cooking oil manufacturers are up in arms against importers who they say the government has given a free hand to bring in oil at preferential duties and repackage for sale locally. It's interesting. You'll find that story on the back page of the Daily Nation. The Star newspaper. Raila's confounding political game plan. Azimio has held over 10 rallies since January and visited 7 counties. And then MP Pokosing's chopper grounded as police probe links to banditry. That story is on page 4. Agony of forest evictees living in Bungoma caves. You'll find that on page 25. And malaria upsurge fears as new mosquito invades the country. That is also there, the Standard newspaper. Ruto takes on World Bank, IMF over loans. President asks lenders to lower rates of borrowing in line with climate change initiatives, since the current setup favors the West, who are the worst polluters, and punishes African countries that are climate change conscious. That story is on page 4. And government supplies neck deep in poverty. Suppliers, contractors who do business with both the national and county government face uncertain times as officials delay or refuse to pay bills owed to them. That you'll find on page 6. Focus shifts to polls integrity after hacking claims. And then women and politics in Nigeria. That is a special coverage there on the Standard. Why houses are becoming unaffordable, and Cabra's RFC rules the roost in rugby. And then in Azimio all the way, Wiper leader Kalonzo Musyoka will, with party members, address the press yesterday after a 2-day retreat in Naivasha, where they vowed to remain in the Azimio la Umoja One alliance. Musyoka supported the ongoing Kenya People's Barazas that are meant to push the government to address the living costs, the high cost of living rather. So that is what we have on the Kenyan newspapers. Let's look at the Newsday from Zimbabwe. NGOs quake as ED digs in. And then Daily News, no polls report issues. That is according to Ziambi, says ED will gazette the limitation report when he gets final documents, and Cyril's lethargy frustrates allies. The Herald, also from Zimbabwe, CVR, readies for mass vehicle registration. And then AU tackles conflicts, targets more trade. And National Youth Day celebrations, all roads lead to Lupane. The Daily Monitor this is from Uganda. Government freezes pay rise, jobs in budget cuts. And then Uganda faces tough choices in Democratic Republic of Congo, and 2 men arrested for gang raping a woman, and Cancer Institute calls for more help. That is what we have on the front page of the Daily Monitor. The News Vision, also from Uganda. Homosexual books seized in schools. Vision scribes graduate, and more MPs, ministers cited in Iron Sheet's case. And then NDA, where is your science on Kanyanja's acaricide? Okay, whatever that is. The Punch newspaper from Nigeria, APC governors, bank CEOs in last-minute rush to clear Naira mess. 12 governors, APC chair want Emefiele Malami to obey Supreme Court order. And the Naira crisis has brought so much pain. Adamu laments, Kandunje Abiodun absent, and then bank CEOs want old note collection extended to avert protest attacks on branches. Very well, and vote for leader with capacity and character. That is what Oyadepo said. Ogun woman sets self ablaze over 70,000 Naira debt. That is sad. And Buhari, Jonathan, others became president unprepared. That I think is an opinion piece there by someone called Coup. And INEC to get poll allocation from Central Bank of Nigeria on Tuesday. And then CAN laments Leah Sharibu's continued captivity. So that is what we have on some of the newspapers from across the continent. I don't have those ones from the UK, but I think you are now up to date with some of the news-making headlines from across the continent of Africa. Now, there's a story that I've been following up for you about this Ghanaian player that was affected during the deadly earthquake that took place in Turkey. So for the most part of last week, there was still some hopes about him being alive, but unfortunately those hopes were thrashed 2 days ago when search teams uncovered the body of this Ghanaian international soccer player Christian Atsu. His agent revealed on Saturday Atsu had been missing following the devastating earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria. The remains of the soccer star, who had been playing for Turkish Super League club Hatayspor, were found amid the ruins of luxury 12-story building where he had been living in the hard-hit city of Antakya, Hatay province. His relatives had gathered at the site waiting by the wreckage, but all too dashed hopes when his remains were found. So the death toll from the 7.8 magnitude earthquake that happened on the 6th of February in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria passed 43,000 deaths on Friday and was certain to increase as such teams found more bodies. Atsu was 31 years old, who previously played for English Premier League clubs Chelsea, Newcastle United, Everton, Bournemouth, signed for Hatayspor from Saudi Arabia side Al Raid FC last year. And reports a day after the quake struck had said that Atsu was pulled alive from the rubble of a collapsed building and taken to a hospital for treatment. And I think we reported that, but it appears that was a misinformation. And Hatayspor, however, announced days later that Atsu and the club's sporting director, Tena Savuj, were still missing. Atsu joined Hatayspor in September 2022 after a season with, like I've said, their Saudi Arabian team Al Raid, and scored the winning goal in the Super League match on the 5th of February. He won 65 caps for Ghana and helped his country reach the 2015 African Cup of Nations finals, where they lost to Ivory Coast in the penalties. So his body was brought back to Ghana yesterday. I believe I was watching it, and tributes have been pouring out for this late footballer. And young players and amateur football club in Ghana's capital Accra are now reacting after former Ghanaian international Christian Atsu was found dead almost 2 weeks after the devastating earthquake in Turkey. And you can see these condolences, and he's being celebrated by his countrymen. So may his soul and those of other over 34,000 people who have since passed from that devastating earthquake, may they rest in peace. And of course, we pray for peace and just solitude for the families that have lost their loved ones and who have been affected, and those who have lost everything they had from this devastating earthquake. It's just one of those natural disasters that you really can't prepare for, and the devastation sometimes can be massive, like we have seen. So that is that. A very sad ending. There were some really hopes that people are holding on to, but that is that. Okay, away from that very sad news. And the deputy head of Sudan's ruling council, Mohamed Daglo, has called the 2021 military coup a mistake. In a televised address, Mr. Daglo said it had become a gateway for the remnants of the former regime of Moammar al-Bashir, who was disposed 2 years ago. He said he had made mistakes, that the lending support to the latest coup was one of them. Hailing December's deal to transition Sudan to civilian rule, Mr. Daglo promised to pursue security reforms, including integrating his RSF. This is the Rapid Sudan Forces, but aka Janjaweed. So don't forget that, the paramilitary group, into the national army. Sudan has been in economic and political turmoil since 2021, when General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan led Junta overthrew and took over power from the civilian-led transitional government, derailing the transition to civilian rule following Bashir's 2019 ouster. Pro-democracy activists have been organizing protests against the military authorities since then. I want to believe what the second in command in the military administration there in Sudan is saying, Mohamed Daglo. I want to believe what he's saying so much, but I also think that he's being very calculated, because it has been very difficult for the military leaders in Sudan to run that country. And because of that coup that removed the prime minister, what is his name? I've forgotten his name. So they removed him. I remember after the coup of former President Moammar al-Bashir, there was a transitional government that was created consisting of 11 members. 6 were from the civilian side, 5 were from the military side. But even arriving at that number was quite a process there, because the military wanted to have an upper hand and have more people, and just a handful of civilians in that transitional government. So after back and forth and all that, there was an agreement, and so 6 civilians and 5 military officials, led by the leader of the transition, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and his deputy, Mohamed Daglo, and then with others. And then on the other side, we had the prime minister at that time and 5 other people. And they seem to have been working well until towards when, because after the ousting of Moammar al-Bashir, that happened, was it in April 2019? Okay, so in August, that is where they created this framework of the transitional government, and it was agreed that this transitional government will be in place for 3 years as the country, puts in measures to transit to civilian rule. And at that point, even the constitution of Sudan has been suspended. I think it has been suspended because the call from the protesting side and from the civil side, but I haven't heard anybody talking about the process of making a new constitution. But the constitution was suspended after that coup. So I don't know what Sudan is operating on. maybe the older constitution or something like that, but I'm not sure about that. And so while they were nearing towards the end of this transitional period, we saw all of a sudden a change from the military side, and they were not willing. You could clearly see they were not willing. Abdallah Hamdok, yes, that is the Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok. So they were not really willing to prepare the way to really have a transition. And from the information that we were receiving, they were really frustrating the civilian side, and they were making it difficult to work in harmony and to steer Sudan towards the path that they both had agreed that Sudan should be steered to. So there was a fallout, and before you know it, Abdallah Hamdok was removed from office. He was detained. At some point, he was also detained in the house of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. He said he detained him in his house, and then he claimed he needed to keep him safe. I don't know from what. And so there has been some disagreement since then. So last year, towards the end of last year, there was something that was signed there, a framework that was signed that could bring them back to the path that they initially had agreed upon. So what I'm reading from these statements that are being made by the deputy head of Sudan's ruling council, Mohamed Daglo, sorry, I don't know, I'm calling him Dagalo, he is Daglo. There seems to be a falling out in the army. For him to come out and say that he regrets how that was done, and by removing, Abdallah Hamdok as the prime minister was a mistake. He was addressing that was a live address, and Mr. Douglas said it had become that coup had become a gateway for the remnants of the former regime of Moammar al-Bashir, who was deposed 2 years earlier. Now, you can say that coup had become a gateway because it is the same people who have been carrying out these protests in the streets in support of Abdallah Hamdok and the civilian side. So if, according to him, he's saying that these protesters who have been protesting in Sudan are the supporters of former President Moammar al-Bashir, this cannot really be true, because the last we checked, there have also been protests in support of the military junta, and one will be forgiven to assume that these protesters who sometimes protest in support of the military junta could actually be in support of the former president, Moammar al-Bashir, owing to the fact that all these military leaders in Sudan worked under Moammar al-Bashir. So sort of they worked together and they were part of the leadership in that regime. And so you would assume that the protesters who protest in support of them would perhaps be automatically be supporters of former president, because the protest against the protest by the other side of the divide, that is the civilian rulers or the civilian side of the leadership, who the people have been supporting and have been protesting when Abdallah Hamdok was removed. So the people protested. So there has been some protest, and even this new framework that was signed, Sudan people are not very happy, the Sudanese. So they went out and they protested against some of the things that were included in this agreement. So for him to say that this became a gateway for the remnants of the former regime, Moammar al-Bashir, who was disposed 2 years earlier, the ones who are causing trouble, I'm not sure if that is the case. I think he's just trying to skate around the issue and not really address the issue that he should be addressing. The issue is Sudan is going through very tough times. And the military junta have realized that the importance of Sudan being part of the international system and working together and in harmony with the international system and with these institutions. Because after they made this move, a few sanctions followed, and there's some few diplomatic gains that the country had made since the removal of Moammar al-Bashir. That was renegated upon. So now they are facing very tough times, and COVID hasn't made things easier for them. And so the cost of living is high, just as it is high for the rest of the world, really. And things are becoming very tough. And they realize they really can't rule the country as they thought they would rule how they used to rule when President Moammar al-Bashir was in power. So what I see from his statements, I think for him to come out and now say he's regretting that coup that happened in 2021, the removal of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, I'm sensing that perhaps there is a divide in the ruling military junta. And at this point, they're not in agreement. Maybe one side wants them to get back to working with the civilian side so that they're able to go forth with this transition, and the other side might be reluctant. Those are just the few things I'm reading. And after the coup that happened in 2019, there has also been attempted coups that we've had, some mutiny happening there in Sudan. So until they're able to get a civilian government or to just for the country to experience this transition, I think Sudan is sitting in a very precarious situation as far as the peace and stability of that country is concerned. And it will be good for this country to just go ahead with this transition, and so that they stop having this to being perennially these protests in the streets and all these things. It's not good for a country. It's like the country has been held ransom since President Moammar al-Bashir left. Really, the things have not come back to normal, and that is because of the military insisting that they have to be part of that. Why couldn't they just be like the way Zimbabwe did or the way Algeria did? I keep referring to these two countries because remember, the coups happened there. In fact, the Algerian coup happened first when President Bouteflika was removed from power in February, and then followed by Moammar al-Bashir. Bouteflika had ruled for 20 years. Bashir had been there for 30 years. So anyway, but the soldiers in Algeria who forced Bouteflika, I think they even wrote that speech for him, because at that point Bouteflika was in a wheelchair. He had suffered a stroke some years back, but he was still insisting on wanting to stay and be the president in Algeria, and Algerians had just had enough of him and his cronies and the corruption that had permeated Algeria at that point. So the protest, and he was in and out of the country seeking for treatment. He was never home, really. He was out of the country most of the time, seeking for treatment. As I said there, he was ill health. He had an ill health. But the military wrote that speech for him, I believe that. Wrote that speech for him. They called the media, the national television there, I suppose, and they said, here, you read that word to word. Because you could see while he was reading that speech, he could not even believe what he was reading. So that tells you he did not prepare that speech. The military had him, read that speech. They wrote it for him, and they were standing there with guns and all that. He had no choice. Bouteflika read that speech, and that was that. But after the military were done with that, they marched back to the garrisons, to the military, barracks. And they've been staying there. So there had been some protests that followed. They're protesting against the people who are still in positions in power, who are still holding positions in important public institutions, who were allies of President Bouteflika, and they've been protesting until majority of them have been removed. Anyone who had perceived to be having a dealing with Bouteflika, in fact, one of his brothers, maybe two, are serving a jail term, and his close associates who had gotten tenders and deals in corrupt ways, and they had run down public institutions and things like that. So majority of them. So the protest continued, but we saw after the removal of President Bouteflika, the Algerian army retreated back and just left the civilian process to take course, and we've seen some good level of stability return to Algeria. So that is not the case with Sudan, because as much as these coups happened the same time frame, the same year, Algeria has gone back to being stable, and they're rebuilding the country, and they're rectifying the things that Bouteflika had done for the 20 years he was in power. Sudan is still stuck in the same space. because the military has insisted they have to stay there. The 3-year period already lapsed. That was supposed to be last year. So there was a probability that elections were to happen this year, and that is not the case. So there's no telling. There's no particular date that has been put forth for an election to happen, because I think a section of the military junta, from what Dagalo is saying, the deputy head of Sudan's ruling council, from what he's saying, you can see there's a clear indication of a military that is not in agreement within itself. So I think there's a section that perhaps is just tired of not seeing progress in the country. And maybe there's a section of that military junta that truly believed that after Omar al-Bashir has left power, the country will see a different kind of leadership dispensation. And so maybe there are those who were, maybe the younger ones, who are eager to see what change that will bring. And now they've seen the old guards just hanging on and refusing to give way and just wanting to be part of the leadership of Sudan by hook and by force. Whether you like it or not, they're there. And so this dalliance brought the conflict now, and the disagreement that we saw with the civilian side that has now left Sudan in a place where the country can't just move forward. So this military junta has held Sudan at a ransom. And for what? So after you saying that you regret and this coup that happened in 2021 and that this is a mistake, so what is your remedy? What are you proposing to be the right thing to do now, Tegalo? Because just admitting that that was a mistake is not enough. What is the way forward now? What is the way forward? How can Sudan move forward? How can Sudan go back to being stable? How can the people of Sudan go back to working and doing other activities and stop protesting? Because as long as you keep holding these positions and you keep not being clear about transition, then you will continue seeing them in the streets. You'll continue seeing Sudanese out there protesting every day. And that is a country that when you have such activities, you can't develop. You don't have time to think about developmental agendas. You don't have time to address the cost of living. You don't have time to address the issues that you're supposed to be addressing as the leadership of Sudan. So you must find a way that you're able to address these issues in a way that will calm down the temperatures. You can't live like this. You can't have a country in chaos, in a perennial protesting mode. That is not how you build a country, military junta. That's not how you do it. So it's good that you have admitted that was a mistake. But now how do you move forward? How do you reconcile with the other side and put aside your interest, which I think will be difficult because, their interest there is at stake should a civilian government come into power, because the issue of ISIS is just hanging on their heads. If the civilian side comes to power and they decide they have to take Omar al-Bashir to the ICC and they give way to the ICC chief prosecutor's office there to start investigations, some of these investigations over the killings that happen in Darfur will really point out some of these top military officials in Sudan who were present and probably had responsibilities during that time. And so they fear that. That, I think, is the main fear they have. If they allow for a transition and this other side comes to power, then now it's going to put their interest at jeopardy. So that is one thing they're fighting. So my thinking is that there could be a divide between the old guard and perhaps the younger Sudanese military who perhaps have no problem with change and have no problem with transition, and the older guards are just want to protect the status quo because their interest is at stake, and they are reluctant to really have a transition because that will not be good for them. I'm just thinking, but I could be wrong. But for Mohamed Daglo to admit that was a mistake, I think it just gives us a glimpse to something in there within the military that is, might not be working so well. There is a divide. And if that is true, then also there is a potential for another counter coup. There is these countries that are being led by military, be it Sudan, after the military coups, be it Mali, be it Guinea, be it Burkina Faso. Chad seems to have gotten that together, so let's assume they are just safe at this point. But these countries that still have the military at the helm, we saw what happened in Burkina Faso. They removed the guy who led the coup that removed President Christian Kabore. Yeah, so as long as you have the military there and those who led these coups, the potential of having a counter coup, I think, is quite the susceptibility, is quite high, and the possibilities are high. So the countries are quite precarious. The peace and stabilities of these countries, Sudan and these others, is quite precarious. So these are things that they should worry about if they truly care about having stable, countries as they would wish to have us believe. Okay. All right. Let's move on to another story. Now, the United Nations Chief Guterres on Saturday called for Africa to take action for peace to combat rising violence as the continent's leaders held their annual summit in Addis Ababa. Africa is reeling from a record drought in the Horn and deadly violence in the Sahel region and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, with the African Union meeting aiming to address these issues and jumpstart a faltering free trade pact. Most of the sessions at the two-day summit are held behind closed doors at AU headquarters in the Ethiopian capitals, and there were things that were expected to be discussed, but let me just read part of what Guterres said. I'm deeply concerned about the recent rise in violence by armed groups in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and the rise of terrorist groups in the Sahel and elsewhere. The mechanisms for peace are faltering, the UN Secretary General warned. Nevertheless, he urged the bloc to continue to battle for peace. At a mini-summit on Friday, leaders of the seven-nation East African community pushed for all armed groups to withdraw from occupied areas in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo by the end of next month. Okay. So now, from what I'm hearing, our East African community leaders had a mini-summit there in Addis Ababa, I believe. And the agreement was for M23 and other rebels to withdraw. Okay, it is the M23 that has occupied that part in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo that has placed Rwanda and DRC at loggerheads. But what these leaders agreed upon was that these armed groups have been given until the end of next month. We are in February. Today is the 20th of February. So until 31st of March, I believe March has 31 days or 30 days, around there. Until the end of March, these gangs, these terrorist groups, these murderers will be allowed to operate, and they've been given another 40 days to continue massacring people in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why are we being so lenient? What was the purpose of the East African Community Force going into the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo? What was the mandate? Do we even need them? Was there a need for them to go there? If we're going to allow these groups time to continue maiming, to continue torturing, to continue raping, continue displacing people from the Eastern Democratic, you're basically giving them time to continue causing these atrocities that they have been causing in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. What are the forces of the EAC doing there? That's what I want to know. And I am a concerned party because I come from this region. Why did we send them there? What was their mandate? I thought their mandate was to fight these groups. What changed? Why are we becoming so lenient? We are going to give them this much time for what? We saw the agreement that was signed in Angola that was to allow for a ceasefire. That was violated just a few days after. So that ceasefire did not hold, only but for a few days. And one of the requirements in the ceasefire was to have M23 leave these areas that it had taken over in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The M23 have not moved back. And from the reports, they keep circling. You know, they look like they're making movements, but they're really not going anywhere. That is what President Tshisekedi said when they were having a meeting, I think, last year in the U.S. He was speaking to the press and he said, no, these people have not moved yet, because that came just after a few days after that Angolan ceasefire deal was signed. So in the meantime, what will be the forces in the East African community be doing? What will be the UN forces, MINUSCO, be doing in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo? Because surely they have not been doing much in protecting the people. Why are we using so much of our public funds? Because from the East African community forces, what I saw from a reporter was just going through the countries that have sent their forces there, like my country, for instance, will spend a good amount of Kenya shillings that would really go to other things that are urgent and are needed in this country. But we do understand our position in this region, and we do understand the importance of the East African communities. So if that was the agreement within the states in the bloc, so Kenya must do its part, and I do understand that, and I'm not even criticizing that. But a lot of money is being used to support these forces that went there. South Sudan, as needy as it is, sent its forces there and also had to use a good amount of money to take its forces there. So countries are sacrificing. For what? If this sacrifice, we can't see results at the end of the day, what is the purpose of it? Can you go back to the drawing board and decide what is the purpose of having the East African community forces on top of 16,000 UN forces that are in the Democratic Republic of Congo? We have 18,000. But the 2,000, the drivers, doctors, cooks, and all these things. But 16,000, those are military forces, men in uniform, combat, there in the DRC. And that has not brought any kind of change since 2013, when they started this mission in Democratic Republic of Congo. So when you have this leaders meeting and the UN General as calling for Africa and the East African Community Bloc to continue to battle for peace. He was calling for the African Union Bloc, to continue to battle for peace. First of all, Guterres, while it is nice and wonderful to give this message to African Union, and I support African Union to continue battling for peace and all that, but you all know that this conflict especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as much as there are a lot of internal factors, interstate, intrastate issues there, interstate, the ethnicity and the inequality and all that, and historical issues that are also still at play in the DRC. But also we have the intrastate where countries have been accused of, like, not M23, like Rwanda and also Burundi, Uganda have been accused, and also we've seen other external forces and countries also being brought in who are thought to be sponsoring, and the activities in the DRC have really helped in fueling this conflict. So while you address the African Union to continue to battle for peace, I think you should also address the larger issues that really also contribute. Because as much as African Union, and I don't know if African Union has done enough in trying to address this issue, but sometimes you do have a limit. You can have as many meetings as you want, like we have seen that has been happening on this same issue. But if the leaders or the core players are not really willing to do the right thing, then you can just do just as much. You know, if President Tshisekedi, he's also being accused of supporting another rebel group in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, by the way, he has never refuted these claims. So there's been these allegations. And then you also have Rwandan president, and Rwanda as a country being accused of supporting the M23. So unless there is a clarity in that, and that is, we find the truth in that, these very allegations, then however much President Uhuru Kenyatta meets and have this mediation process, however much President of Angola, Lourenço, meets with the Rwandan president and Tshisekedi to sit down and want to mediate between these two leaders, however much Qatar plans another meeting there and have these players, actors come. But if you are not going to address the issues, the core issues that you should be addressing, then it is difficult. There's nothing more the African Union can do. There's nothing more the East African Community Bloc can do. There's nothing more. There has to be a willingness, and there has to be some level of honesty, and there has to be some level of, people who are willing to engage from a perspective of actually wanting to find a solution. Tshisekedi has been accused. Rwandan president last year, he said Tshisekedi, he's not, elections are coming up in December of this year, and Tshisekedi does not want to have elections. So Rwandan President Paul Kagame was claiming that Tshisekedi is not interested in finding peace because he's looking for an excuse of not having elections this year, which I thought was in bad taste. And then he questioned Tshisekedi's legitimacy as the president. He said he didn't even win anyway. That's what Rwandan president. So you can see for them, it has become a very personal thing between these two leaders. So if that is the case, and they are the co-actors, so how do you find a solution to that? How do you propose AU goes about that? There has to be a willingness. There has to be a willingness. However much these other efforts are really important and might help, and these other players are really putting in some work and trying to find a solution, but we will keep making steps forward and more steps backwards, because there is no honesty in this process. It's not anchored in really finding a solution. And these leading actors have now turned this into a ping pong game, and while they do that, the people are suffering. People are still dying. In the Eastern Democratic of Congo, people are still being uprooted from their homes. That is the sad part. And the ADF terrorist group, attacks have continued. And for me, all of them are just terrorist groups anyway, because if you wake up in the morning and what you're thinking about is how many lives I need to destroy today, and how many lives I need to kill, how many people I need to murder to gain my own mileage for whatever reason, then you are a terrorist. You are a terrorist. So all these groups, to me, they're just that. Okay, so it's good to urge for peace, but there has to be a willingness. So Guterres met with several African leaders on Friday, including Rwandan President Paul Kagame, to discuss in particular the crisis in Congo. And also he mentioned the issue to do with the coups that have happened in the continent and the instability in the Sahel region. The junta ruled Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea, which have been suspended from the AU, did not participate in the summit. But diplomats of the three nations were in Addis Ababa to work for a readmission. Are they serious about this? I think we've talked about this. And this is what Guterres said. I endorse your call for the restoration of civil civilian and democratically elected governments in Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan. And Moussa Faki Mohamed, head of the African Union Commission, told the meeting the bloc needed to come up with new strategies to counter the backsliding of democracy on the continent. He said that sanctions imposed on member states following unconstitutional changes of government do not seem to produce the expected results. It seems necessary to reconsider system of resistance to the unconstitutional changes in order to make it more effective. That's interesting. So they're saying the sanctions, which were meted against these countries that changed government in an unconstitutional way, they're saying the sanctions don't seem to be biting enough. And maybe that's why these countries that are now being led by the military, they're really not in a hurry to go back to allow for transition. You know, I would agree with Moussa Faki. I would agree with him, because if they were biting as much, because that is what sanctions are supposed to do. Sanctions are supposed to make you very uncomfortable. Sanctions are supposed to turn you people against you because of how they get affected by these sanctions, and then you have to do right and maybe change your perspective on a move that you had made that earned you this sanction. That, you know, just one of the ways that diplomacy works. And so it's interesting that these three nations, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, actually four, and Sudan, but especially Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, I think a week ago, thereabout, they held, the foreign ministers from these countries held a press conference, and they really are looking for the readmission to the African Union. And when I was tackling this matter the last time, I said there's no shortcut. The African Union is not going to bend over their laws and rules and regulations for you. It is very clear, if you want to be a member of the African Union, then you must have a civilian role. It's just as simple as that. So if you really want to be part of that, then these military juntas, Assimi Goïta, he must resign. And these others from these countries, they must resign. El Burhan from Sudan must give way to elections so that a civilian leader can be in Sudan. You cannot have your cake and eat it. I know Chad did that, which is also very confusing, and maybe that is where these countries are coming from. They're thinking, but Chad had a similar thing, although it was not really a coup. Idris Deby was murdered, and his son, who was in military, was, instantly bestowed as the leader, transitional leader of that country, and his rule was extended last year by 2 more years. That has caused a lot of jitters and has attracted some protests there in Chad. It is a little different, but nearly the same, because all of them did not follow the proper way, the constitution, as far as having the new regime is concerned. So maybe it's because the way Chad's issue was handled and the transition, maybe that's why they feel they can also be allowed to get away with that. No, you can't. You can't. Organize for an election. Organize for an election and let a civilian person be in power. And these military juntas, if they really must be in power, and they have to be, let them resign from the military and let them be civilians and be there as leaders in the different countries. I think we can't change that for you. And so Faki also said that it seems necessary to reconsider the system of resistance to the constitutional changes in order to make it more effective. That is to consider the sanctions, So the summit also discussed the acceleration of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think if African can realize this, and this is a very important institution, that if Africa can realize the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it was launched in 2020, but it has really not been implemented. If we are able to do this, that will catapult the economies of the African countries in levels that we've never seen before. So I I don't want to gloss over it because I don't have time, but I think perhaps this is something that requires time for us to understand, because a lot of people across this continent don't even realize this. And the deal is billed as the biggest in the world in terms of population gathering, with 54 out of the 55 African countries, with Eritrea the only holdout. So Eritrea has not signed into this one. African nations currently trade only about 15% of their goods and services with each other, and the FTA aims to boost that by 60% by 2034 by eliminating almost all tariffs. So this will be very good for this continent. But as I said, it's something worth just taking time and looking at. So I'll just leave it there. I don't want to gloss over it. Anyway, it's quite something. So I think I would like to... Well, Libyans on Friday marked the 12th anniversary of their 2011 uprising. I still have like another 3 minutes of the February 17th revolution. And many cities witnessed major celebrations in the capital. Tripoli residents took to the streets to celebrate, with squares decorated with national flags and lights. What are they celebrating about? This is interesting. Libyans took to the streets on Friday, which marked the 12th anniversary of the uprising that toppled Moammar Gadhafi from power. And they were celebrating with music performances by Libyan singers and bands that attracted large crowds of people in Tripoli's main square. A huge military parade took place in the square as part of the celebrations as well. And the anniversary of the uprising comes amid the continuing political stalemate and government division. That's why I'm wondering, what are Libyans celebrating? Like 12 years now, what has the country gained really from that uprising? 12 years now, what do you have to show for that uprising? Like, what are you even celebrating about? The country split into two rival administrations in the chaos that followed the uprising, each backed by different rogue militias and foreign governments. That is what is there. And right now, even the government, the side that is backed by the UN, is deeply under foreign government influence. So the UN Special Envoy for Libya warned at the end of last year that signs of partition are already evident, and urged influential nations to pressure Libya's rival leaders to urgently finalize the constitutional basis for elections. All right, so Libya is going to be divided now. On February 17th, 2011, Libya descended into a series of protests similar to that experienced in many Arab states at that time, which was termed as the Arab uprising. People started the popular uprising that overthrew Colonel Moammar Gadhafi's 42 years of reign and dictatorship, but the oust of Gadhafi often remembered by NATO's involvement, a coalition including France, Britain, and the US. These were the spearheaders of the destruction that we now see in Libya today. France, Britain, and the US under NATO. Okay, there's a lot there to talk about and to unpack that I'm not willing to do as per right now because my time is up. But Libyans were celebrating their 12th anniversary. I don't know what they're celebrating. I don't know if there's anything to smile about. I don't know if there's anything to be celebrated there in Libya, but a section of them seems to be happy. And I'd like to know who even sponsored these celebrations. It's interesting. Okay, I want to thank you so much for your time this morning. I'll see you here later, 3 p.m. East African time. We shall be looking at the latest news from across the continent of Africa. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.